Kill them. Kill all 22 of them. Leave nothing breathing in that valley. He said it the way other men order breakfast. Then he pressed his eye back to the scope and counted the Americans loading into their convoy vehicles below, laughing, drinking coffee, completely unaware that their routes, their radio frequencies, their exact departure window had already been purchased with an informant's life. 17 fighters, every exit sealed, every ambush position loaded and waiting. Hine had built this massacre using the stolen name of a dead American legend. And the only thing standing between him and 22 body bags was a young woman everyone on that base had already written off as nobody. They had no idea. If you are watching this right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens in this valley over the next 18 minutes is something you are going to want to watch until the very last second. The first time Master Chief Donovan Brennan saw Kira Ashford, she was untangling a radio cable with her teeth. Not the most impressive entrance for someone who would later be described in classified debriefs, sworn statements, and eventually in letters to the Secretary of Defense as one of the most lethal human beings ever to set foot on Afghan soil. But that was the thing about Kira. She had spent her entire adult life making sure that nobody looked at her too carefully, that nobody saw what was underneath. Brennan remembered walking past her workstation that first morning and thinking young, quiet, probably smart, definitely out of place. She had the kind of posture that suggested military discipline, back straight, shoulders level. No wasted movement, but everything else about her said she belonged somewhere safe, somewhere with fluorescent lights and climate control and coffee that didn't taste like motor oil. New comms girl, he said to Staff Sergeant Pete Larkin, who was standing nearby pretending to review a maintenance log, but actually watching the new arrival with a particular brand of skepticism that decorated soldiers reserve for everyone who hasn't yet been shot at. Larkin shrugged. Ashford, Kira Ashford, transferred from Bagram. Her file says she's good. What does her file not say? Larkin grinned. That she's about to spend the next 3 months getting called the secretary behind her back. And he was right. Within 48 hours, the nickname had spread across the entire forward operating base, with the casual cruelty that military humor often carries. Not malicious exactly, just honest, because FOB Liberty in the summer of 2014 was a place that respected one currency above all others: the ability to put a bullet precisely where you wanted it. And a 24-year-old woman with headphones and a radio handset didn't seem to be carrying much of that. The SEALs stationed at Liberty were a particular breed. These were men who had deployed 6-7 times. Men who had been shot, blown up, and rebuilt. Men who trusted exactly 3 things in this world: their training, their teammates, and their equipment. Everything else was background noise. And Kira Ashford, as far as they were concerned, was background noise. She didn't complain about the nickname. She didn't push back. She didn't try to prove anything. She just worked. 16-hour days behind the communications array, monitoring frequencies, logging transmissions, cross-referencing. Enemy chatter with satellite imagery. She ate alone most nights. She ran her 4 miles every morning before anyone else was awake. And at night, when the base went quiet and the generators hummed and the distant mountains turned dark and enormous against the Afghan sky, she sat on the eastern edge of the compound with a notebook in her lap and wrote things down that nobody ever asked to read. Brennan noticed that too. He noticed most things, which was why he had survived 17 years of combat when a lot of smarter and faster men hadn't. He noticed the way she held herself when she was stressed, not rigid, not twitchy, but controlled, contained, like someone who had been trained to absorb pressure without letting it escape through her body. He noticed the way her eyes moved when new intelligence came through the system, not reading it the way a technician reads data. Reading it the way a hunter reads terrain. He noticed these things, filed them away, and said nothing. Because Donovan Brennan was the kind of man who believed that people revealed themselves eventually. You didn't need to dig, you just needed to pay attention. It was the end of Kira's 3rd week at Liberty when the first piece of the puzzle fell into her lap. She was running a routine sweep of enemy radio frequencies, a task so repetitive and low priority that most comms specialists did it on autopilot while half their brain was somewhere else. But Kira never did anything on autopilot. She had learned that from her father. Marcus Ashford had told her when she was 12 years old and sitting in a deer blind in rural Virginia, learning to hold a rifle steady, That the moment you started thinking something was routine was the moment it got you killed. She heard the transmission at 2:47 in the morning. It was short, heavily encrypted, layered under about 4 different masking frequencies that were clearly designed to look like standard generator interference. If you were tired, if you were distracted, if you were just checking a box on a list, you would hear it and log it as static. Kira heard it and sat up straight. Her fingers moved fast across the keys, running the signal through 3 different decryption filters before she got anything usable. What came out the other side wasn't clean. It was fragments, broken syllables, partial phrases, but it was enough. Supply corridor. Eastern approach. Transit window 48 to 72 hours. She read it 4 times. Then she pulled up the satellite imagery of the eastern approach routes and started cross-referencing with terrain data. Her notebook came out. Her pen started moving. And for the next 3 hours, while every other person on that base slept, Kira Ashford mapped a pattern that nobody had seen. By 6 in the morning, she had filled 11 pages. By 7, she was standing outside Brennan's door. She knocked twice. There was a pause, the kind of pause that told you the person inside had been awake for a while and was deciding whether to pretend otherwise. "It's open," Brennan said. She stepped inside. His quarters were Spartan, even by FOB standards. It caught a folding table, a tactical map pinned to one wall, with enough annotations on it to give an archivist a headache. He was sitting in a canvas chair with a mug of something that smelled aggressively of coffee and nothing else. He looked at her, looked at the notebook in her hand, looked back at her face. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I need 10 minutes, she said. He gestured at the opposite chair. "You've got 5, make them count." She sat down, opened the notebook, and put it on the table between them without ceremony. "There's an ambush being planned," she said. "Eastern corridor. The supply convoy that's scheduled to depart in 3 days is the target. Whoever is setting this up has good intelligence on our routing and our timing windows, which means either we have a leak or they have better SIGINT capability than anything in this region should be able to support." Brennan didn't move. He picked up his mug, took a slow drink, put it back down. "Walk me through the signal." She did, all of it. The frequency layering, the decryption process, the fragments she'd extracted, the terrain analysis, the pattern recognition. She talked for 12 minutes without stopping because she had too much to cover, and the math of 5 minutes had never been strictly enforced by either of them. When she finished, Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How confident are you?" 85% on the ambush, 90% on the leak. "And the other 10? "The other 10 is the part that scares me more than anything else I found." She reached into the notebook and turned to a page near the back. Written there, circled, twice underlined, once were 2 words. "The Carpenter." Brennan's expression changed, just slightly, just enough for someone who was paying attention. "That's a code name," Kira said. "It appears in 4 separate transmissions over the last 6 days. It's always used in reference to the tactical coordinator of whatever is being planned. Someone on the other side is running this operation under that name." The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. "You know what that name means," she said. It wasn't a question. "Where did you hear it?" Brennan said. His voice had gone very flat, the way voices go when the person speaking is working very hard to sound like they're not affected by something. Kira took a breath. "My father used to talk about Carpenter. Not the enemy version, the American version." She paused. "Marcus Ashford. That was his battlefield nickname before he died." The mug came down on the table with more force than Brennan intended. He stood up. He walked to the map on the wall. He stood there with his back to her for a longer time, and she let him because she knew what he was processing, and she knew that some things needed a few seconds of silence before they could be handled properly. "Your father," Brennan said without turning around, "was the best sniper I ever watched work, and I watched a lot of them." He paused. "I served with him. Twice, 2003 and 2009. He never mentioned you." "He wouldn't have," Kira said. "He kept his family completely separate from his work. He was very careful about that." "What was he careful about that you're not telling me right now?" Another breath. This one slower. "He trained me," she said, "from the time I was 12 years old until 2 months before he died. Every leave he got, every deployment break, every weekend, home part of that time, was spent in a range or in the field with me behind a rifle. He said he didn't know why he felt the need to do it. He said it was something he had to do." She met Brennan's eyes when he finally turned around. When he died, I made a promise to my mother. I told her I was done. No more rifles, no more scopes, no more any of it. How old were you? 17. And you've kept that promise for 7 years. Yes. Brennan crossed his arms. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was calculating not just facts, but implications. Not just what was being said, but what the person saying it was capable of. How good were you? He said. When I was 17, I was hitting targets consistently at 800 yards in crosswind conditions with my father's M24. She held his gaze. My father told me the last time we were in the field together that I was better than he'd been at my age. A pause. He said it like he wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. The room went quiet again. Outside the base was waking up. Voices, vehicle engines, the distant thump of rotors somewhere over the mountains. The ordinary machinery of a military day that had no idea what was being discussed in this small room at this specific moment. Brennan sat back down. Show me the terrain analysis again, he said. She opened the notebook. He leaned forward. And for the next hour, the two of them mapped an ambush that hadn't happened yet, while somewhere in the mountains, the man who had stolen her father's name was checking his scope adjustments and waiting for 22 Americans to drive straight into the killing ground he had spent 4 months building. It was later, much later, after everything that Brennan would tell the story of that morning to the investigators, to the journalists who eventually got pieces of it, to anyone who asked him how it all began. And he always said the same thing. He said the moment he really knew was not when she showed him the 11 pages of analysis. It was not when she told him her father's name or explained her training or described her capabilities. It was something smaller than all of that. It was the way she held the notebook. Most people, when they're nervous, grip things. They squeeze. Their knuckles go white and their fingers tighten, and their tension escapes through their hands because the hands are the hardest part of the body to lie with. Brennan had watched hundreds of soldiers in high-stress briefings, and he knew the pattern. Kira held the notebook the way you hold something that you've had for a long time. Loose and familiar, like it was part of her. Like the information inside it was an extension of something she already knew in her bones, and the paper was just where she'd written it down so she wouldn't have to carry it all in her head. That was when he knew. She wasn't a communications specialist who had stumbled into something too big for her. She was someone who had been waiting without knowing it, without intending it, for exactly this moment, trained for it, shaped for it, built for it, by a dead man who had somehow understood that his daughter was going to need everything he could give her. The convoy was scheduled to leave in 72 hours. They had work to do. What neither of them said out loud, what both of them understood with the particular clarity that comes from years of military experience, was that somewhere in the chain between Phoebe Liberty and the convoy's destination, someone was passing information to the enemy. Someone with access. Someone trusted. Someone who had helped build the trap that was waiting in the Eastern Valley. And that person had no idea that a 24-year-old woman with a 7-year-old promise in her dead father's handwriting in a notebook had just started pulling on the thread that was going to unravel everything. The SEAL's initial reaction to Brennan's preliminary briefing was predictable. Chief Petty Officer Ray Callahan, 7 tours, 3 combat decorations of face that looked like it had been specifically designed to express maximum skepticism, said it in 5 words. You're joking, the comms girl. Brennan didn't answer that. He just kept laying out the intelligence. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Ortega, who was 29 years old and had the particular energy of someone who believed very strongly in very specific processes, said, with respect, Chief, we have trained snipers on this base. If the convoy needs overwatch, we put our guys on overwatch. That's what our guys are for. Our guys haven't seen this terrain, Brennan said. Nobody has seen the terrain except from imagery. She has. Silence. Imagery isn't the same as Ortega started. She has her father's journals, Brennan said. Marcus Ashford spent 6 months in this region in 2007. He mapped that valley. He mapped the ridge lines, the sight lines, every natural firing position on every elevated feature within 1,200 yards of the road. He wrote it all down, and his daughter has been reading those journals since she was old enough to understand what they said. Another silence, a different kind. Callahan said, Marcus Ashford. Yes, the Marcus Ashford. Is there another one? Callahan looked at his hands. Then he looked at the ceiling. Then he looked back at Brennan with the expression of a man who was performing a fundamental revision of something he had believed to be settled. The secretary, he said. That's what you've been calling her, Brennan said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It landed exactly where he intended it to land. I'm going to need you to stop doing that now. In the communications room, which was separated from the main briefing area by a thin partition that nobody had ever pretended provided actual acoustic privacy, Kira sat with her headphones on and heard every word. She didn't smile. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt the particular weight of someone who has just had the door opened into a room they have been standing outside for a long time, not with excitement, but with the sober knowledge of what it means to walk through it. On the floor beside her workstation, sealed in a hard-sided case that had traveled with her to every posting she'd had since she was 18 years old, was her father's M24. She hadn't opened that case in 7 years. She put her hand on the clasp, then she took it away. Not yet. She still had analysis to complete, transmissions to monitor, a leak to trace. She still had the 72 hours before the convoy rolled out, and every one of those hours needed to count. But her hand remembered the clasp. Her fingers remembered exactly how the case opened, exactly where the rifle nested inside it, exactly what the weight of it felt like when you lifted it into position. Some things you learn so deeply that no amount of time can make you forget them. Marcus Ashford had taught her that too. One of the last things he ever said to her sitting on the porch of their house in Virginia in the fall 2 months before the accident that killed him, watching the leaves come down in the kind of ordinary, beautiful, completely unheroic way that leaves always come down. You have a gift, Kira. I know you didn't ask for it, and I know sometimes it feels like a burden, and I know your mother worries about what it means for your future. But here's the truth about gifts like yours. They don't go anywhere just because you stop using them. They wait. And someday when someone needs what you have more than anything else in the world, that gift is going to be the only thing standing between them and something terrible. She had been 17. She hadn't known what to say. So she'd said nothing, and they'd sat there together watching the leaves fall, and it had been one of the last truly peaceful afternoons of her life. Now, 7 years later, in a communications room in eastern Afghanistan, with 22 soldiers' lives riding on a convoy that was driving toward an ambush that only she had seen coming, Kira Ashford finally understood what her father had meant. She reached down, she put her hand back on the clasp, she held it there, and she made a decision that was going to change everything. The decision Kira made that night in the communications room didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything. It felt like the end of a very long argument she'd been having with herself for 7 years, an argument she had finally run out of reasons to keep winning. She opened the case. The M24 was exactly as she remembered it. Matte black, worn in all the right places from years of her father's hands. The stock carrying the faint ghost of his grip, the way old tools carry the memory of the person who used them most. She didn't pick it up. Not yet. She just looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something that represents a version of yourself you thought you'd buried. Then she closed the case, locked it, and went back to her radio array. Because before any of that mattered, she had a leak to find. The next 36 hours were the loneliest of her career. Not because she was alone. The base was full of people, full of noise and movement and the constant mechanical rhythm of military life. But the work she was doing existed in a space that nobody else could share with her. She couldn't explain what she was looking for without revealing how much she already suspected. She couldn't ask for help without tipping off the wrong person. And she couldn't stop because every hour she didn't have an answer was another hour the convoy rolled closer to departure. She drank bad coffee and ran the frequencies and cross-referenced transmission logs with personnel movement records and told herself she wasn't scared. She was scared, not of the ambush, not of the rifle, of the thing she was going to find at the end of this particular thread, because she already had a feeling about what it was, and that feeling sat in her chest like a piece of shrapnel that hadn't been removed yet. At 4:16 in the morning, 41 hours before convoy departure, she found it. It wasn't dramatic. It never is with leaks. There's no sudden flash of revelation, no single document with a red stamp across it that says traitor in block letters. It's always quieter than that, a pattern of timestamps. A communication log that shows someone accessing routing data 6 hours before that routing data was requested by the people it was supposedly being accessed for. A digital fingerprint that doesn't belong to the hand it's registered to. She stared at the name on her screen for a long time. Then she picked her notebook, wrote 3 lines, tore the page out, folded it twice, and walked to Brennan's door for the second time in 3 days. This time she didn't knock. She slid the folded paper under the door and walked away. 2 minutes later, his door opened. Ashford. She stopped walking, but didn't turn around. Get in here, he said. She went back. I was standing at his table with the paper unfolded in his hand. His face had the particular stillness of a man who had just been handed confirmation of something he hoped he was wrong about. He read her 3 lines twice. Then he set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and he said, "How sure are you? How sure are you?" "The timestamp discrepancy alone is 72 minutes, she said. Routing data for the Eastern Corridor was accessed by that account at 2300 hours on Tuesday. The convoy commander didn't formally request Eastern routing options until 0011 Wednesday. Someone pulled that information before it existed as an official request. That's circumstantial. There are 4 other instances going back 18 days, same account, same pattern. Every time sensitive movement data was accessed outside of operational necessity, the transmission cluster I've been tracking spiked within 6 hours. Brennan put both hands flat on the table. He breathed through his nose. If I act on this without going through proper channels, if you go through proper channels, Kira said, and the wrong person finds out we're on to them, the ambush gets moved up and we lose the intelligence advantage. We lose everything. The silence was very loud. I know, he said finally. I know that. He picked up the paper again, looked at the name one more time, and something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Not anger exactly, and not grief exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has just watched something they believed in get destroyed. How long have you known? She asked. I didn't know, he said. I suspected 3 weeks ago. Something didn't line up on a patrol debrief, and I couldn't put my finger on what. I told myself I was being paranoid. He paused. I should have pulled that thread harder. You couldn't have followed it to where I followed it, she said, not unkindly. You didn't have what I had. The frequencies. The frequencies and time, and the fact that nobody was paying attention to me, which meant I could move through the data without anyone noticing what I was looking at. He almost smiled at that, almost. Being invisible has its uses, he said. I've been thinking that for 3 days. He folded the paper one more time and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he looked at her, really looked at her with the full weight of a man who was about to place an enormous amount of trust in someone who had not yet fully proven they could carry it. The convoy leaves in 41 hours, he said. I'm going to handle the internal problem quietly through channels I trust, which means 2 people. That's all. What I need from you is the tactical piece. The overwatch position. Yes. My father's journal identifies the optimal firing position on the eastern ridge as a natural rock formation approximately 400 meters above the valley floor, offset 30 degrees north of the road center line. It gives sight lines across the entire primary kill zone and most of the secondary positions. If someone is going to run a sniper operation from the high ground, that's where they'll be. Which means that's where you need to be first. Yes. Another pause, another round of that careful measuring look. My guys are not going to like this, he said. I know. Callahan especially. I know. He's going to say things that aren't polite. Master Chief, Kira said, and something in her voice shifted, not hard, not defensive, just very, very clear. I grew up with Marcus Ashford as my father. I have been underestimated by men who could shoot the wings off a fly at 500 yards since I was 12 years old. I have heard everything Ray Callahan is going to say, and worse, and I am still standing here. So let him say it. Brennan looked at her for one more long moment. Then he said, get some sleep. Briefing is at 0800. She nodded and turned to leave. Ashford. She stopped. Your father would have been proud of those 11 pages. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She walked out of his quarters and down the corridor and back to her workstation, and she sat down in her chair and put her headphones on and stared at her screens for a very long time without seeing any of them. Because Marcus Ashford was the one subject she didn't trust herself to talk about without losing the composure she needed to maintain for the next 41 hours. She had time for grief later. Right now, she had work. The 0800 briefing was exactly what she expected and exactly what she had prepared herself for. Brennan laid out the intelligence without attribution, presenting the ambush analysis as a composite of multiple sources. The SEAL operators listened with the particular focused silence of men who had sat through hundreds of these briefings and could identify within the first 30 seconds whether the information in front of them was real or noise. This was real and they knew it, and the quality of the silence changed accordingly. It was when Brennan got to the tactical response that the room shifted. Overwatch on the Eastern Ridge, he said. Single shooter covert insertion night prior. The position needs to be established before 0400 on departure day to maintain concealment advantage. Which one of us? Callahan asked. Ashford. The silence that followed was a different animal entirely. Callahan said, "Come again." "You heard me, Ray. I heard you say the comms girl is taking Overwatch on a mission with 22 lives on the line. I heard you use a nickname that I told you to retire," Brennan said. His voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now, something with weight. "This conversation is going to go better for everyone if we skip past that part and get to the part where I explain why." "Then explain," Callahan said. "Because I've got 6 snipers on this base with a combined 400 yards worth of combat confirmed kills. And you're telling me, I'm telling you that not one of those 6 snipers has her father's journals." A beat. "Marcus Ashford mapped that valley in 2007, Brennan continued. "Every elevated firing position, every natural hide site, every angle and distance, and environmental variable. His daughter has been studying those journals for 17 years. She knows that terrain the way your snipers know ranges they've trained on for a decade. And she can shoot." He paused. "I've seen her quals. She can shoot." The room was very quiet. Danny Ortega, who had been sitting back with his arms crossed in the posture of a man reserving judgment, uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. "The Carpenter connection," he said. "The code name, that's real. Verified across 4 separate intercepts. So whoever is running this ambush is deliberately using her father's name." "Yes." Ortega thought about that for a moment. Then he looked at Kira, who was standing at the edge of the room, very still, very straight, her hands at her sides, and he said, "Can I ask you something directly?" "Go ahead," she said. 7 years is a long time away from a rifle. How do you know what's still there?" It was a fair question. It was the only question in the room that deserved a real answer, and everyone knew it, and the quality of the attention shifted again when she opened her mouth to respond. "I don't know for certain," she said. "Nobody can know that for certain until they're in the position. But here's what I do know. My father trained me from age 12 under the theory that the fundamentals of marksmanship, when built correctly and deeply enough, don't degrade the way other physical skills degrade. He believed, and the research supports this, that precision shooting is 60% mental architecture. Calculation, breath control, patience, the ability to manage your own nervous system under extreme stress. Those things don't atrophy. They go quiet, but they don't leave." And the physical side, Ortega pressed. "I've been running 4 miles every morning and maintaining upper body conditioning every evening since I was 17. I have not touched a rifle in 7 years. My hands know what to do. The question is whether my mind will let them." The room sat with that for a moment. Then Callahan said, and his voice had changed not much, but enough to mean something, "That's the most honest answer I've ever heard anyone give before a combat operation." Kira looked at him. "I've been called worse things than honest," she said. Something moved across Callahan's face. He looked down at the tactical map. He looked back up. And then Ray Callahan's 7-tour veteran, 3 combat decorations, the most skeptical man on forward operating base Liberty, gave a single nod that said more than anything he could have put into words. The briefing continued. That afternoon, Kira went to the range. Alone, no audience. She had asked Brennan for that specifically, and he had arranged it without comment because he understood that some things needed to happen in private, not because they were shameful, but because they were sacred. She set up at 300 yards first. She opened the case. She lifted the M24 out with both hands, and the weight of it hit her in a place she hadn't visited in 7 years. Not emotional, not sentimental, physical. The specific gravitational presence of a precision instrument that had been built to do one thing and had spent years waiting for permission to do it again. She worked the bolt, checked the action, ran through the function check with movements so ingrained they happened below the level of thought, her hands finding each position without any instruction from her conscious mind. Her father's hands, she thought. These are his movements living in my muscle memory. She went prone. She found her position. She breathed. And then for the first time in 7 years, she pressed her eye to the scope. The world through the glass was smaller and larger. At the same time, the way a scope always makes the world and the crosshairs settled across the target downrange with a steadiness that surprised even her. She breathed out. She felt her heartbeat slow to the patient rhythm that her father had spent years teaching her to find. She felt the trigger under her finger. She fired. The shot went exactly where she put it. She worked the bolt without lifting her head and fired again. Again. Again, she shot for 2 hours. She moved from 300 to 500 to 700 yards methodically. The way her father had always insisted, not starting close to build confidence, but starting at the distance where technique either holds or it doesn't, so that you know the truth about yourself before you need that truth to matter. At 700 yards in a 15-knot crosswind, with the light failing and her shoulder aching from the recoil she hadn't absorbed in 7 years, she put 7 consecutive shots into a group that a quarter would have covered. She lay there for a moment after the 7th shot, cheek against the stock, breathing, letting the stillness settle around her. Then she heard a sound behind her, footsteps. She hadn't heard anyone approach. That bothered her because she should have. She didn't move. 7 out of 7, Callahan's voice said from about 15 feet behind her. At 700 in that wind. She finally lifted her head and rolled to a seated position. He was standing with his arms at his sides, no expression on his face that she could read, which from Callahan probably meant he was working very hard at not having one. You were watching, she said. Brennan asked me to. He said I could do this alone. He said you could do this without an audience, Callahan said. He didn't say he wouldn't have someone on the perimeter making sure you were safe. A pause. And making sure the intel was real. She looked at him steadily. And, she said, he looked at the targets downrange. He looked back at her. And then Ray Callahan did something she had never seen him do in the 3 weeks she had been at FO Liberty. He said, I'm sorry for the name, for all of it. She held his gaze. Were you wrong to be skeptical? I was wrong about what I was skeptical of. That's a different thing. Yes, he said. It is. She stood up, picked up the rifle, and began the breakdown with the same fluid economy of motion that had characterized everything she did when no one was watching, and now did with someone watching, because there was no longer any reason to hide it. Tomorrow night, Callahan said, when you go up that ridge, I want to give you something. She looked at him. He held out a small piece of paper folded, worn at the edges, the kind of paper that had been in someone's pocket for a long time. She took it and unfolded it. Written on it in the particular compressed shorthand of an experienced sniper's field notes were wine tables, specific to this region, specific to the Eastern Valley, annotated with observations that could only have been made by someone who had spent hours on those ridgelines with a scope and a notebook. I ran a recon of the Eastern approach last spring, Callahan said. We didn't end up needing the overwatch position on that op, but I took notes anyway. Habit. He paused. The thermal patterns in that valley are strange. The way the wind moves off the secondary ridge creates a deflection effect that doesn't match the standard modeling. Your father's journals won't have that because it's a seasonal variable and he was there in winter. She looked at the notes. She looked at him. Why are you giving me this? She said. Because 22 guys are getting in those vehicles day after tomorrow, he said. And I am going to do everything in my power to make sure they come back. He paused. Everything, including admit when someone else is the right person for the job. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She didn't say thank you in the particular language of people who communicate through action rather than sentiment. There was nothing she could say that would carry the weight that needed to be carried in that moment. Instead, she said, tell me more about the thermal deflection. Everything you observed. Callahan sat down on the ground beside her, which in any other context would have been remarkable, a senior SEAL chief sitting in the dirt with a comms specialist to talk about wind physics, and for the next 2 hours until the light was completely gone, they talked. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, without either of them noting the exact moment it happened, she stopped being the comms girl. she became something else. What she became didn't have a name yet. It would have one eventually. The stories would give it one, the reports would formalize it, the letters from 22 different families would make it permanent. But in that moment on a dark range at a Phoebe Liberty, with a folded piece of paper in her pocket and her father's rifle in her hands, she was simply a person who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what she was capable of. That night, 3 hours before she was due for pre-insertion prep, Kira sat on her cot with her father's journals open in her lap. She had read them so many times that she could have recited most of them from memory. But she read them again now, not for the tactical information, not for the terrain analysis, not for any of the practical intelligence they contained. She read them for the parts between the data. The moments where Marcus Ashford had stopped writing like a soldier and started writing like a man. There was one passage she always came back to. Page 47 of the third journal. Written in 2007, the deployment where he had mapped the Eastern Valley, the same ground his daughter was about to walk. It read, spent 4 hours on the ridge today watching the road below and thinking about what it means to be the person nobody sees until the moment you're needed. I think that's what this work is. You are invisible right up until the moment when your invisibility becomes the thing that saves everyone else. And then you're visible forever, whether you want to be or not. I don't know yet which part of that is the gift and which part is the cost. Maybe they're the same thing. She read that passage 3 times, then she closed the journal. She lay back on the cot, closed her eyes, and let herself think for just a few minutes before the discipline kicked back in about her father. About the porch in Virginia and the leaves coming down, and the way he looked at her sometimes like he was seeing something in her that she couldn't see in herself, something that scared him and amazed him in equal measure. Something he didn't know how to explain, except by putting a rifle in her hands and teaching her everything he knew. She thought, I understand now, Dad. I finally understand what you were doing. You weren't making me a weapon. You were making me a shield. 12 hours later, under a moonless sky with Callahan's wind tables in her left breast pocket and her father's M24 across her back, Kira Ashford climbed the eastern ridge alone and disappeared into the darkness above the valley where 22 American soldiers were about to face the worst morning of their lives. The convoy would roll at dawn, and somewhere in the shadows above the killing ground, a man who had stolen her father's name was already waiting. She reached the position at 0347, 13 minutes ahead of her own deadline, which was the kind of margin her father had always insisted on. Not because 13 minutes would change anything tactically, but because the extra 13 minutes were where you settled, where you stopped moving and started breathing and let your heart rate drop from the climb and your hands go from cold and tight to warm and ready. Marcus Ashford had called it the quiet before the quiet, the stillness you had to find before the real stillness of the shot. Kira found her position in the dark by feel more than sight, exactly where her father's journal had described it, exactly where Callahan's wind notes confirmed the geometry worked. She went prone without a sound. She arranged herself with the patient precision of someone who understood that the next several hours would be spent in this exact configuration, and that any discomfort she didn't address now would become a problem later at the worst possible moment. She pressed her eye to the scope. The valley below was dark and empty and perfectly still. She checked her radio, 1 click to confirm position. Brennan's voice came back immediately, 2 clicks, which meant received and understood, and do not transmit again unless necessary. She settled in, and then she waited. Waiting is the part that nobody talks about. Every story about snipers focuses on the shot, the calculation, the breath, the trigger, press, the result. Nobody talks about the hours before. The way your mind starts to negotiate with you when there's nothing to do but lie still and think. The way doubt finds the cracks in your confidence and starts working at them like water finding its way through stone. Kira had been warned about this by her father. He told her that the most dangerous enemy a sniper faces is never on the other end of the scope. It's always in their own head, and the only weapon against it is a mind disciplined enough to choose what it thinks about. So she chose carefully. She ran her calculations again. Wind 7 to 9 knots from the northwest with Callahan's deflection variable, adding 2 to 3 knots of effective push from the secondary ridge. Temperature dropping toward dawn, which would affect bullet density and drop at range. Primary target zone 400 to 600 yards, secondary zone out to 800. She ran the numbers quietly, methodically, the way her father had taught her not to produce answers she didn't already have, but to keep her mind in the work instead of somewhere it didn't belong. At 05.2, the first light began to separate the mountains from the sky. At 0534, she heard the convoy. The sound traveled up from the road in fragments. Engines, the mechanical groan of heavy vehicles navigating rough terrain, the occasional metallic clank that was part of the ordinary vocabulary of a military column moving at dawn, 22 men, 11 vehicles. Everything Brennan had briefed. She watched them enter the valley through her scope and felt something she hadn't expected, a fierce, almost painful tenderness toward those vehicles and the men inside them. These were people who had gotten up that morning and eaten whatever passed for breakfast at the Fabi and climbed into their vehicles believing that their worst problem today was going to be dust and boredom. They had no idea what was waiting for them. They had no idea that the only reason they still had a chance of surviving the next hour was a woman lying alone on a ridgeline above them who had broken a 7-year promise to be here. She breathed out slowly. Stay in the work, she told herself. Stay in the numbers. At 0541, the convoy was fully in the valley. At 0542, Kira saw him. It wasn't dramatic. It was a shadow moving against a shadow, a shift in the geometry of a rock formation on the western ridge that was too deliberate to be wind. She adjusted her scope, dialed in the magnification, and found him a figure so well concealed that if she hadn't known exactly where to look from the exact angle, her father's journal specified she would never have seen him at all. I was good. She recognized that immediately and without any satisfaction. The man across the valley was a real professional, not a militia fighter playing at precision work. He had selected a position with overlapping cover. His profile was broken up correctly. His rifle was angled to minimize any optic reflection. He had done everything right, everything except account for the fact that Marcus Ashford's daughter was already watching him. She tracked him through her scope and felt the rules of engagement land on her like physical weight. She could not fire until he demonstrated hostile intent. That was the rule. That was the law. And she understood it not just as an order to follow, but as a principle she believed in because the alternative to rules of engagement was something she didn't want to be part of. But understanding it didn't make it easier to lie there with her crosshairs on a man she knew was about to kill someone and wait. Her radio crackled. Brennan's voice barely above a whisper, overwatch, sit rep. She keyed twice, all clear, which was not quite a lie. She had eyes on a hostile, but she didn't have weapons free, and transmitting that information on an open channel, even an encrypted one, carried risks she wasn't willing to take. She went back to watching. At 0548, the enemy sniper settled. She knew that settling. She had felt it herself 1,000 times in training, the moment when your body stops adjusting and your breathing goes shallow and the world reduces itself to the distance between your eye and the scope and the target at the end of it. He was coming up on his shot. She found the lead vehicle of the convoy in her peripheral vision. She looked back at the enemy sniper. She looked at the lead vehicle. She made a calculation that had nothing to do with wind or temperature or bullet drop, a moral calculation, the kind that happens in fractions of a second but carries the weight of a lifetime. And then the enemy sniper's barrel moved toward the lead vehicle, and the word came over the radio that she had been waiting for with every cell in her body. Weapons free. She fired. One shot. The sound of it cracked across the valley and disappeared into the mountains, and the enemy sniper's position went still, in the specific way that distinguishes stillness by choice from stillness that has no choice left in it. For exactly 2 seconds, the valley was completely silent. Then it erupted. The scale of it hit her before the sound did. She felt it through the rock. She was lying on a deep, concussive trembling as firing positions that had been invisible a moment ago suddenly became very visible. Muzzle flashes appearing across the ridgeline in a pattern that told her immediately and with sickening clarity that this ambush was far larger than any of the intelligence had suggested. She counted muzzle flashes in the first 3 seconds. She got to 11 before she stopped counting and started working. Radio traffic exploded simultaneously. Multiple voices overlapping the controlled panic of trained soldiers, absorbing the reality of a situation that had gone from zero to catastrophic in the time it takes to exhale. Contact left, RPG 3 o'clock. Vehicle 2 is hit, vehicle 2 is hit. Medic up, I need a medic. Brennan's voice cut through. Overwatch, we have multiple contact points. I need eyes on the western ridge, confirm. She was already working. The machine gun position was the priority. She had located it in the first second of fire-elevated fixed pouring, sustained fire down onto the convoy from an angle that gave the vehicles almost no natural cover. She calculated the distance at 540 yards, adjusted for the crosswind. Callahan's notes had predicted, felt her heartbeat, felt her breath, and fired. The machine gun went silent. She was already moving to the next target before the echo of her shot had finished traveling across the valley. An RPG team, 2 men, one with the launcher, one carrying reloads, had broken cover on the eastern slope to get an angle on the lead vehicles. She saw them before they were fully positioned. She had maybe 4 seconds before they had a shot. She took 1 second to confirm. She took 1 second to adjust. She used the remaining 2 seconds to fire twice. Both men went down. Overwatch, what is your status? Brennan's voice. She keyed the radio, once busy, and kept her eye in the scope. The thing that happened next was something she would spend years afterward trying to explain and never quite managing to. It wasn't that she stopped thinking. It was closer to the opposite. She started thinking on a level that felt less like cognition and more like physics. The targets and distances and wind variables and her own breath and heartbeat all became part of a single continuous calculation that ran below the surface of anything she would have described as conscious thought. And her body executed what the calculation required with a precision and a speed that felt in the moment completely inevitable. Enemy spotter, northern ridge, 700 yards, exposed for 12 seconds while repositioning. She took the shot at the 8-second mark. Secondary machine gun position. She had flagged it as a probable during her pre-dawn scan, a natural rock shelf that provided exactly the kind of cover a support gunner would want. When it opened up, she was already dialed for the distance. 2 shots, 5 seconds apart. A fighter breaking cover to flank the convoy's rear vehicle. She tracked him for 3 seconds, let him commit to the movement, and took the shot when he was fully exposed. Over the radio, she could hear the battle shifting. The convoy had stopped moving, vehicles couldn't advance through the volume of fire, but the return fire from the soldiers below was finding its targets, organized now by Brennan's voice cutting through the chaos with the particular authority of a man who had done this many times and knew that authority was the only thing that prevented panic from compounding the damage being done by the enemy. Second vehicle driver's position, get that door open and get Morrison out. Northern contact is suppressed, shifting to Kunkun. I need that RPG position neutralized. Somebody give me target down. Her voice on the radio for the first time since the firing started. Northern RPG neutralized. A beat of silence on the net that lasted maybe half a second. Then Brennan, copy Overwatch. Confirm Northern RPG. Confirmed. Eastern machine guns suppressed, currently tracking southern movement, standby. She was already on the next shot. At minute 4, a group of fighters attempted to move down the slope to close the distance to the convoy. 6 men moving in pairs with cover from above. She picked the lead pair first, which stopped the movement and forced the remaining 4 to go to ground, which removed their tactical advantage and bought the convoy soldiers time to reposition. She heard Callahan's voice on the net. He was coordinating the QRF response from the base, and the sound of it steadied something in her that she hadn't realized needed steadying. She was not alone in this valley. She was the most alone person in the fight, but she was not alone in the fight, and that distinction was carrying more weight than she expected. At minute 7, something changed in the pattern of enemy fire. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only noticed if you had been tracking the rhythm of the engagement with the part of your brain that processed pattern rather than content. The firing from 2 positions on the western ridge that had been consistent since the ambush opened, suppressive professional discipline, suddenly became something else. Shorter bursts, longer pauses between them. Not suppression anymore. Searching. They were looking for her. She had known this was coming. The moment she opened fire from the eastern ridge, she had become the most dangerous variable in the enemy's plan, and the man running this ambush. The man calling himself the Carpenter was not the kind of commander who left dangerous variables unaddressed. He had trained his people well enough to suppress the convoy. He was now redirecting some of that capacity toward the problem on the ridgeline. She moved, not far 3 meters, shifting her position along the rock to a secondary hide she had identified during her pre-dawn setup. But she did it in the 8-second pause between firing, going flat, and pulling herself sideways with her elbows while keeping the rifle in contact with the ground. and she was settled into the new position before the next burst of probing fire came in over the ridge, close enough that she felt the displaced air. That was too close. Overwatch, we're getting reports of fire on your ridge, Brennan said. Aware, she said. Continuing mission. Kira, his voice just for a moment dropped the operational register and became something more human. Are you hit? Negative, continuing mission. She found her next target. At minute 9, a soldier below, she later learned his name was Corporal James Whitaker, 22 years old, from a small town in Ohio, made a decision that almost got him killed and ended up saving 3 of his teammates. His vehicle had been hit by RPG fire in the first minute of the ambush and was burning, and he had gotten his 4 passengers out and into cover behind a secondary vehicle. But one of them, a medic named Torres, was hit and bleeding badly, and the cover they had wasn't going to hold against the flanking movement that had just started on the south side of the road. Whitaker stood up, not recklessly, not stupidly. He stood up in a controlled way with his rifle up and his body positioned to draw fire because he had calculated correctly that someone needed to draw fire, and he was the one in the best position to survive it marginally. Kira saw him stand. She saw the 2 fighters who had been setting up the flanking shot see him stand. She saw their rifles come up. She fired twice in 1.4 seconds. Both fighters went down before either of them had completed the motion of raising their weapons. Whitaker looked up at the ridgeline. He couldn't see her. Nobody could see her. That was the point. But he looked up anyway, the way people look toward the direction of something they can feel but not explain. Over the radio, his voice, somebody just saved my life from up on the ridge. Who is that? Who is on Overwatch? Nobody answered him directly, but she heard it, and it hit her somewhere deeper than the tactical part of her mind that had been running the engagement hit her in the part where her father lived, where the 17-year-old who had made a promise to her mother lived, where all the years of trying not to be what she was had stored themselves up, waiting for this exact moment to mean something. She blinked once, twice. Then she went back to work. Minute 11 brought the twist. She had been tracking the enemy communications through her earpiece. Brennan had patched her into a parallel feed of the intercepts she'd been monitoring before the mission, and at minute 11 a transmission came through that was different from everything else. Not a tactical coordination signal, not a fire control instruction, something else, a voice she hadn't heard in any of the previous intercepts. Calm, measured, speaking not to the fighters on the ridgeline, but to a position she hadn't yet located, using language that was operational in its precision and personal in its fury. She is there, the voice said in accented English, as if he wanted to be understood specifically and completely. The daughter of the carpenter is there. Find her. She is one person. There are 17 of you. Find her and end this. The voice of the new carpenter. The man himself, no longer coordinating from a distance. He had inserted himself into the tactical net because his ambush was collapsing, and he knew why. And the why was a 24-year-old woman on a ridgeline who had systematically dismantled everything he had spent 4 months building. He was angry. She could hear it under the control, the way you hear a fire under a door. The heat comes through even when the flame doesn't. And he was close. She scanned the western ridge with new intent, reading it differently. Not looking for fighters, but looking for the place a commander would position himself. Not in the middle of the action, not in a standard firing position, somewhere elevated, somewhere with sight lines across the entire valley, somewhere a man with tactical experience and a sniper's instincts would choose if he wanted to both command and engage. She found him at minute 13, 620 yards. Partially concealed behind a rock formation that would have been invisible to anyone without specific knowledge of that western ridgeline's geometry. He had chosen well an excellent position, genuinely excellent, the kind of position her father would have chosen, which was probably not a coincidence. He was looking for her. She could see through the scope the methodical way he was scanning the eastern ridge, patient, disciplined, breaking the terrain into sections and working through each one. He hadn't found her yet. He would. She estimated she had 60 to 90 seconds before his scan reached her position. She also had a problem, the angle. At 620 yards with his position partially masked by the rock formation, she had perhaps 4 to 6 inches of exposed target, head and partial shoulder depending on how he moved. The wind had shifted in the last 3 minutes. Callahan's notes had predicted this. She had factored it in, but factoring it in and executing a 600-yard shot on a 4-inch target in shifting wind were two very different categories of challenge. This was the shot her father had always described as the shot that separates what you know from what you are. Over the radio, the battle was continuing. Soldiers were fighting, men were wounded. The QRF was still 12 minutes out. The convoy was still in the valley, still under fire from the positions she hadn't yet neutralized, still dependent on the overwatch position that was about to be compromised if she didn't act in the next 45 seconds. She felt all of that. She carried all of that. And then she set all of that aside because there was no version of this shot that got made while carrying the weight of everything that depended on it. Her father had taught her that you carry the responsibility before the shot and after the shot, but during the shot, you carry nothing except the calculation. She measured the wind. She adjusted. She found the rhythm of his breathing through the scope, the slight movement of his shoulders, the barely perceptible shift of his position as he inhaled and exhaled, and she timed herself to it, which was something Marcus Ashford had spent 6 months teaching her, and which she had thought she would never use in a situation where it actually mattered. She breathed out. She felt her heart beat. She waited for the pause between beats. And in that pause, in that half second of absolute stillness that exists between one heartbeat and the next, she pressed the trigger. 620 yards of air and wind and mathematics. The echo of the shot traveled across the valley and came back changed. Small or diminished the way all sounds become when the thing that made them is finished. Through the scope, the position on the western ridge went still. Completely still. The new carpenter was gone. For 3 seconds after the shot, Kira didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, eye to the scope, breathing, letting the reality of what she had just done settle into the part of her that processed reality. Then she lifted her head and looked at the valley below. Something was changing down there. The fire from the western ridge, which had been the backbone of the entire ambush. The coordinating element that kept all the other positions functional was losing its organization. Without the commander's voice on the tactical net, without the force of his will, holding the structure together, individual fighters were beginning to make individual decisions, and individual decisions in the middle of a firefight are almost always the wrong ones. They started to break. One position went quiet, then another. A fighter on the southern slope stood up to reposition and was immediately engaged by soldiers from the convoy who had been waiting for exactly that kind of error. 2 fighters on the western ridge, apparently trying to extract, moved in the open for 11 seconds and paid for it. The ambush was collapsing them. And over the radio, in the beautiful chaotic overlap of trained soldiers realizing they were going to survive something they weren't supposed to survive, the reports started coming in. Southern contact is breaking off. Western ridge is going quiet. We've got movement on the road, they're pulling back. And then Brennan's voice, controlled and steady and carrying underneath it something that might have been in a different context in a different man. The beginning of tears. Overwatch. Confirmed status. She keyed the radio. 10 enemy combatants neutralized, she said. Commander element eliminated. Remaining hostiles are breaking contact. Convoy is clear to move. The silence on the net lasted long enough to mean something. Then from somewhere in the middle of the convoy, a voice she didn't recognize, a soldier who had no idea who was on the other end of that transmission. Someone who had just spent 18 minutes believing he was going to die and had just been told he was wrong. A single sentence came over the radio with the raw, unedited quality of something spoken before anyone had time to think about whether it was the right thing to say. "Oh my God, who is that? Who just did that?" She didn't answer. She laid her head down against the stock of her father's rifle just for a moment, just long enough to feel the solid reality of it against her forehead. And she closed her eyes and she breathed and she let the valley below her come back to something that was not quite quiet, but was no longer the sound of men trying to kill each other. The shooting was over. Every American in the valley was still alive. The convoy began moving at 0608. 22 men, 11 vehicles, 7 wounded, none critical, moving out of the valley at a pace that was faster than standard and slower than panic, which was exactly the right pace for soldiers who had just survived something they weren't supposed to survive and hadn't yet had time to process what that meant. Kira watched them from the ridge until the last vehicle cleared the valley mouth. She didn't move until she couldn't see them anymore. Not because she needed to watch. The tactical threat was over. Brennan had confirmed the QRF was in position. The remaining enemy elements had broken contact completely, but because she needed to see them go. All of them. Every vehicle. She needed the visual confirmation in a way that went beyond operational necessity, in a way that was entirely personal, and that she would not have been able to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 18 minutes lying alone on a ridgeline, deciding who lived and who didn't. When the last vehicle disappeared, she put her forehead against the stock of the M24 one more time. Then she began the breakdown. She worked with the same methodical precision that had characterized everything she'd done in the last 12 hours, her hands moving through the familiar sequence while her mind stayed very deliberately in the present, this bolt, this catch, this component, this case, because the present was manageable, and everything outside the present was something she wasn't ready to look at yet. Not the shots she'd taken, not the faces she'd seen through the scope, not the specific weight of what 10 enemy combatants meant in terms she didn't have military language for. Her father had warned her about this too. He'd called it the after, and he'd told her it was the part that most people weren't prepared for because nobody trains you for the after. They train you for the before and the during. The after is something you figure out alone, usually in the dark, usually when you're too tired to defend yourself against it. She was alone. It was getting light. She was very tired. She finished packing the rifle, shouldered the case, and began the descent. It took her 40 minutes to get back down the ridge. 40 minutes of careful movement on terrain that was harder going down than it had been going up her legs, shaking slightly from hours of prone stillness and the sudden demand of weight-bearing movement. She focused on her footing. She focused on the next step. She did not think about anything else. At the base of the ridge, Brennan was waiting. He was alone, which she understood immediately was a deliberate choice on his part. He had come himself without the SEAL team, without support personnel, without anyone whose presence would have made the next few minutes into something more public than they needed to be. He looked at her when she came off the last rock and onto the flat ground. He looked at the rifle case on her back. He looked at her face, which she knew was doing things she couldn't fully control anymore because the discipline that had held everything in place for the last 18 hours was beginning at the edges to come apart. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Everyone came home." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet. 7 wounded, he said. Morrison has a serious leg wound, but he's going to keep the leg. Torres took shrapnel in the shoulder already in surgery at Bagram. The others are walking wounded. He paused. Nobody died, Kira. Not one person. She nodded again. Whitaker is asking about the Overwatch shooter, Brennan said. He's been asking since they cleared the valley. He wants to know who saved his life. She finally found her voice, or something close enough to it. What did you tell him? I told him I'd pass along his gratitude. That's not an answer. No, Brennan agreed. It isn't, but it buys us some time before this becomes a conversation we have to have in front of more people than just the two of us. He looked at her steadily. Are you all right? It was such a simple question. 4 words. The kind of question that has 100 possible answers and only one honest one, and the honest one is usually the hardest to say. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. He accepted that with a nod that said he'd expected it and respected it. Can you walk? I've been walking for 40 minutes. I mean, can you walk into that base and hold it together for the next 2 hours while I manage the immediate aftermath? Because there are things that need to happen in the next 2 hours that require your presence and your coherence, and I need to know if you have both. She straightened her shoulders. She felt the familiar weight of discipline reassert itself, not as a mask, but as a structure, the frame that held everything else up when everything else wanted to come down. Yes, she said. He put his hand on her shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. Not long, not sentimental, just long enough to mean something. Then he turned and they walked back toward Phobie Liberty together, and neither of them said another word for the entire 20 minutes it took to get there. The base already knew. That was the first thing she noticed when they came through the gate. The quality of the attention was different. People stopped what they were doing. Not dramatically, there was no sudden silence, no crowd gathering, but in the specific way that a place changes its atmosphere. When something significant has happened, and everyone knows it, but nobody has been officially told yet. Eyes found her, then looked away, then found her again. Ortega was the first person to speak to her directly. I was standing near the comms building, arms crossed, and when she walked past, he uncrossed them and said, 700 yards in that wind, On a moving target. He shook his head slowly. I did the math this morning. The geometry of that shot on the RPG team, alone the angle, the timing, that's a shot most of our guys couldn't make clean. She stopped walking. Most of your guys haven't spent 17 years learning how to make it. No, he said. They haven't. He paused. I owe you an apology. At the briefing, when I questioned, you asked the right questions, she said. You were right to ask them. The fact that the answers turned out a certain way doesn't make the questions wrong. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained more things than she had the energy to catalog. Your father, he said, he was something, and so are you. She kept walking before her face could do what it wanted to do. The debrief happened at 900 in the main briefing room, with Brennan running it and Kira seated at the table rather than standing at its edge, the way she had been for every briefing since she arrived at Liberty. The change in her physical position in that room was noticed by everyone present and commented upon by no one, because some changes announce themselves through action and don't need words. She walked through the engagement methodically. Target identification engagement sequence, timing the moment she had detected the commander, and what that detection had changed about the tactical picture. She was precise and thorough, and she did not use words like feel or instinct, because this was a debrief, and debriefs required the language of data. And she was disciplined enough to give them what they needed, even when what she was describing had contained moments that no amount of data language could fully represent. When she got to the final shot, the 620-yard engagement that had ended the commander, the room was quiet in a way that had texture. Callahan said, walk me through the wind calculation on that shot. The shift at minute 11, the variable off the secondary ridge. She walked him through it. All of it. The numbers, Callahan's own notes, the timing adjustments she had made in the 2 minutes between identifying the target and taking the shot. When she finished, Callahan said, that's exactly what I would have done. It was coming from Ray Callahan, the most complete form of professional respect and available in that room. Everyone at the table understood that, including Kira. Thank you, she said. Your win notes saved the shot. Your shot saved 22 lives, he said. I think we're even. The debrief lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Brennan kept her behind. Just the two of them, the rest of the team, filing out with the particular focused energy of people who had survived something significant and were processing it through action gear checks, equipment, maintenance, the physical rituals that military people use to re-anchor themselves in the ordinary when the extraordinary has just happened. Brennan sat across from her at the empty table and said, there's going to be an investigation. She had known this was coming. It didn't surprise her. On what grounds? On the grounds that a communications specialist conducted a covert sniper operation outside her authorized duties during a combat engagement. The bureaucratic language will be more elaborate, but that's what it means. He held her gaze. It's going to be ugly. Senior officers who had nothing to do with this mission are going to have opinions about it that are informed primarily by how it reflects on them. And the soldiers who survived, they'll be asked to give statements, all of them. He paused. I don't think that's going to go the way the investigators expect. She understood what he meant. She nodded. There's something else, he said. His tone changed just enough that she straightened in her chair without meaning to. The internal matter I told you I was handling quietly, he said. The leak. She waited. I moved on it last night while you were on the ridge. The individual in question is in custody, remanded to a secure location pending formal charges. He stopped. What I didn't anticipate, what none of us anticipated, is what came out of the initial questioning. Tell me. The leak wasn't operating alone. There's a network. The information that was being fed to the enemy ambush coordinator came from at least 3 separate sources within the coalition structure. One of them is here. 2 of them are outside this base at different levels of the command chain. His voice was measured and controlled, and underneath it was something that in another man she might have called fury. This wasn't opportunistic intelligence gathering, Kira. This was a structured operation. Someone put this network together deliberately, specifically, to enable attacks on American forces. The air in the room went very still. The carpenter, she said, not a question. The man calling himself that, yes. He wasn't just a battlefield commander. He was running an intelligence operation. The ambush today was the biggest engagement in a series that goes back at least 18 months. Convoy attacks, patrol ambushes, 3 incidents that were attributed to random enemy contact that weren't random at all. He put both hands flat on the table. He was using your father's name to build a reputation, to recruit, to intimidate. Every successful attack got credited to the carpenter, which made him larger, which brought him more resources, which enabled bigger attacks. Kira was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he studied my father extensively. From what we can piece together, he spent years studying Marcus Ashford's tactical philosophy. He used it. He adapted it. He built an entire operational methodology around it. Brennan paused. Which means that in some sense what you did today, defeating his ambush, eliminating him, was your father's tactics defeating a man who thought he had mastered your father's tactics. She thought about that. She thought about the journals on her cot, the 47 pages of her father's handwriting that had guided her to the right position in the right shot. She thought about her father's voice in her memory. They don't go anywhere just because you stop using them. They wait. The network, she said. How far up does it go? That's what the investigation is going to determine. And that's why what you found, the initial intercepts, the leak, identification, the encrypted transmission analysis, all of that is now primary evidence in something much larger than a single ambush. He looked at her directly. You didn't just save 22 lives today. You may have broken open the intelligence operation that has been killing American soldiers for a year and a half. She absorbed that. It was a lot to absorb. It sat on her chest with a weight that was completely different from the weight of the engagement itself. Not the immediate physical pressure of a firefight, but the slow, heavy gravity of consequence. The kind that doesn't hit you all at once, but arrives in layers, each one adding to the ones before, until you understand the full shape of what has happened. At 1100 hours, Corporal James Whitaker came to find her. She was in the comms room because the comms room was where she worked, and working was what she knew how to do. When everything else was too large to hold, and she was running frequency checks with the particular focus of a person using a task to keep themselves from feeling things they weren't ready to feel. He knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. I was 22 years old, which she already knew. But seeing it in person was different from knowing it as a data point. He had a bandage on his left forearm from a fragment wound, in the specific expression of someone who had very recently been confronted with the fact of their own mortality and was still working out what to do with that information. He said, "Are you Ashford?" "Yes," she said. "Were you the overwatch?" She considered briefly the option of deflecting. Then she said yes. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. He was the kind of young man who wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it yet. She could see him working at it, turning things over, trying to find the version of what he needed to communicate that would carry the actual weight of it without falling apart on the way out. "There were 2 of them," he said finally. "The guys setting up on the south slope. I stood up because I didn't have a better option. I knew when I stood up that I was probably going to get shot." He stopped. "I have a daughter, 8 months old. Her name is Lily." Another stop. "I would like for her to have a father." Kira put down what she was holding. She didn't say anything right away. Not because she didn't have words, but because the words she had were not the ones she trusted herself to deliver, without the composure coming apart. And she needed the composure for both of them. She needed to hold it together for this 22-year-old father with a bandaged arm and 8 months of daughter at home, who needed to see that the person who had made his survival possible was herself intact enough to receive his gratitude. "She will," Kira said. 2 words. But she said them with the full weight of certainty, not reassurance, not comfort, but the simple statement of a fact that she had helped to make true. Whitaker nodded. He pressed his lips together. He was not going to cry, or if he was going to cry, he was going to do it somewhere that wasn't this doorway, which was a decision she respected completely. "My father told me once," he said, "that the people who save your life, the real, saves the ones where you were actually going to die. Those people become part of you, like they're in your bloodstream." He said he carries everyone who ever saved him everywhere he goes forever. He paused. "I'm going to carry you." She held his gaze. "Carry your daughter too," she said. "She's the reason you stood up." He left. She sat with that for a while. By 4,400 hours, the statements had started coming in. Brennan had been right about the way it would go. The investigators from the JAG office had expected perhaps some professional loyalty from the soldiers, a certain reluctance to throw a colleague under the bus or alternatively a straightforward factual account that could be interpreted in whatever way the senior officers needed it to be interpreted. What they got instead was 22 separate statements written independently without coordination that converged on the same essential narrative, with the kind of consistency that only happens when people are all telling the truth about the same thing. Torres the medic wrote 7 pages from his hospital bed at Bagram, dictating to a nurse because his shoulder made writing impossible. He described the moment his vehicle was hit, the moment he went down, the moment the flanking fire that would have killed him and the 4 soldiers with him was eliminated by shots from the eastern ridge. He described the specificity and timing of the overwatch fire in terms that made clear he understood as a trained soldier exactly what the person on that ridge had accomplished and how difficult it would have been for anyone to accomplish it. Morrison, the driver with the leg wound, wrote 4 pages. At the end of them, he added in handwriting that was unsteady from the medication, "I wanted on record that the person on that ridge did not just save my life. They saved my family, my wife, my 3 children. Every birthday and Christmas and ordinary Tuesday for the rest of all of our lives is owed to whoever was up there. Please make sure whoever reads this understands that I am not using figures of speech." Callahan submitted a formal tactical assessment that was 11 pages long and constituted in the precise and measured language of military professional evaluation, a complete and comprehensive dismantling of any argument that Kira's actions had been anything other than exactly what the situation required. He ended it with a single sentence that was not written in the style of a tactical assessment, but that no one at any level of the review process had the standing to remove. "I have been in combat for 17 years, and I have never seen shooting like that from anyone, and I have seen the best in the world. At 1600 hours, something happened that nobody had anticipated." Kira was summoned to Brennan's quarters. When she arrived, he was not alone. There was a colonel she had never seen before, late 50s, the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped performing anything and just showed what was actually there, sitting across from Brennan with a tablet in his hand. "Colonel Harris," Brennan said. "He flew in from Bagram." She looked at the colonel. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely unreadable, which in her experience meant either very good news or very bad news, delivered by someone who had learned not to lead with either. "Sit down, Specialist Ashford," he said. She sat. "I've read the debrief," he said. "I've reviewed the engagement data. I've spoken with Master Chief Brennan." He set the tablet down. "I've also spoken with 3 members of the oversight committee that will be reviewing the tactical circumstances of this morning's engagement." He paused, and in the pause there was the particular weight of someone who is about to say something that they have spent the day deciding how to say. "The investigation will proceed because it has to. Procedures were not followed. That fact exists regardless of outcome, and I won't pretend otherwise." Another pause. "However, the committee is also aware that the outcome of this morning's engagement, 22 soldiers alive, an ambush neutralized, an enemy commander eliminated, and an intelligence network exposed, is an outcome that this command would struggle to achieve under any circumstances with any resources." Kira said nothing. "Your father served under my command," Harris said, "twice, 2001 and 2005. He was the finest soldier I ever knew. And I say that having known a great many." He held her gaze. "He told me once, the last time I saw him, that he had a daughter he was training. He said she had the gift." Harris stopped. "I thought he was being sentimental. Fathers often are." He picked up the tablet again and stood. "I was wrong." He left. Kira sat in the chair for a long time after he walked out. Brennan didn't say anything. He understood that there are moments that need silence, the way wounds need air. Not because silence heals them, but because it gives them space to be what they are without being compressed into something more manageable. When she finally spoke, she said, "My mother is going to be very angry with me." Brennan, who had clearly been expecting something more, let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Probably," he said. "She made me promise." "I know. She's going to say I lied to her." "Did you?" She thought about it. "I kept the promise for 7 years," she said. "And when I finally broke it, it was to save 22 people who didn't know me and owed me nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse." "Call her," Brennan said. "Not yet." "Kira." "Not yet," she said again, and her voice this time was not the controlled voice of the overwatch position, or the debrief room, or any of the professional contexts she had inhabited for the last 40 hours. It was something younger than all of that, something that had been waiting with a great deal of patience to be allowed to be what it actually was. I need to do something first. She went back to her quarters. She took her father's journals out from under her cot. She sat on the cot with all three of them in her lap, and she held them the way you hold things that are both precious and painful, not tightly, not desperately, but with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that some things cannot be held any harder than they already hold you. And for the first time since she was 17 years old, standing at a grave in Virginia, while her mother wept beside her, Kira Ashford cried for her father. Not for long, not with the abandon of grief that has been stored for 7 years, that would come later in its own time, in its own way. But enough for the 17-year-old who had made a promise she shouldn't have had to make. Enough for the 24-year-old who had spent 7 years trying to be less than she was. Enough for the daughter of Marcus Ashford, who had climbed a ridge in the dark with her father's rifle on her back and her father's words in her pocket and her father's belief in her blood, and who had done exactly what he had raised her to do. She cried until she was done crying. Then she wiped her face, stood up, set the journals on her pillow, and went to find a phone. Her mother answered on the second ring, the way mothers always answer when they have been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, and the sound of her voice familiar and warm and carrying within it the specific frequency of unconditional love that no amount of military training ever fully displaces, hit Kira somewhere she hadn't expected. "Hi, Mom," she said. A pause. Her mother knew her voice the way she knew every inflection of it, had known it for 24 years. And in the pause, Kira could hear her hearing it, hearing the exhaustion and the weight and the thing underneath both of those. "Kira," her mother said, "what happened?" She told her. Not all of it, not the details, but the essential truth of it in the plain and honest language that she had always used with her mother, even when the language was difficult, because her mother had earned honesty the same way she had earned everything else, by being there through every version of Kira that had existed so far. When she finished, the silence on the line was long. Then her mother said in a voice that was doing several things at once and managing all of them, "I'm angry. I know. You promised me. I know. And I'm God. I'm so proud of you. I'm furious, and I am so unspeakably proud of you, and I don't have words for both of those things at the same time." "Dad did," Kira said. "He wrote about it in the journals. He said you were always better at carrying two things at once than he was." Another silence, different in quality. "He wrote about me," her mother said. Not a question, almost a whisper. "A lot," Kira said. "He wrote about you a lot." The phone call lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, something that had been very tightly wound for a very long time was slightly less tight, which was not the same as loose, but was in the direction of it, which was enough for now. That evening, as the base settled into the kind of evening that follows extraordinary days, slightly quieter than usual, slightly more deliberate people moving through their routines with the heightened awareness of people who have recently been reminded how quickly routines can end, Kira sat outside the comms building and looked at the mountains. Callahan came and sat beside her. He didn't ask permission, and she didn't need him to. They sat in silence for a while. Then he said, "The investigation is going to find in your favor. I don't know the timeline, but I know the outcome. The statements are too clear, and the tactical record is too complete for it to go any other way." "That's not what I'm thinking about," she said. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the eastern ridge. Dark now, the last light off the mountains, the rock face where she had spent 18 minutes of her life doing something she had spent 7 years trying never to do. "I'm thinking about what comes next," she said. "Not the investigation, not the politics, just what comes next. For me, what I do with this." Callahan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know yet." She paused. "I know what my father would say." "What would he say?" She looked at the ridge for another moment. Then she looked down at her hands, the hands that had held the rifle, had held the notebook, had held the journals, had been placed on the clasp of the case 3 days ago, in the dark of the comms room, and made a decision that had changed everything. "He would say that the gift doesn't belong to the person who has it," she said. "He believed that completely. He said it to me more than once, and I never fully understood what he meant until today." She closed her hands slowly. "He meant that it belongs to the people who need it, and the only question that matters is whether the person carrying it is willing to use it for them." Callahan didn't say anything, but he stayed where he was beside her, while the mountains went dark and the base settled into its evening, and 22 men who were alive because of 18 minutes of precise and terrifying grace went about the ordinary business of being alive, eating dinner, writing letters, home, checking their phones, carrying the particular quiet gratitude of people who understand, at least for now, exactly how close they came to never doing any of those ordinary things again. The investigation began on a Tuesday, 3 days after the Valley. 3 days after 18 minutes that had rearranged the architecture of everything what people at Phobie Liberty believed about capability, about identity, about the particular danger of deciding you already know what someone is worth before you've seen what they can do. The investigators arrived from Bagram in a Black Hawk that landed at 0730, and Kira watched it from the window of the comms room where she was already working, because working was still the thing she trusted most when everything else was in motion. There were 4 of them, JAG officers, 2 of them, plus a colonel. She didn't recognize a civilian in a suit that was too clean for anywhere near a forward operating base, which told her immediately that this had escalated beyond the standard chain and reached somewhere with different interests and different stakes. Brennan met them at the landing pad. She watched him shake hands with the kind of controlled cordiality that military men produce when they are managing something they consider a threat to someone they have decided to protect. He didn't look toward her window. He didn't need to. The message was already understood. She turned back to her screens. The first interview was at 0900. They took her into a room. She had never used a formal space table and chairs, a recorder on the table. A JAG lieutenant who introduced himself as Captain Reyes and had the particular careful energy of someone who understood that this case was not what it appeared to be on the paperwork and was navigating that understanding very cautiously. He read her the relevant regulations. He informed her of her rights. He asked her in the formal language that formal proceedings require to describe her actions on the morning of the engagement in her own words and in her own time. She described them. All of it, the position, the timeline, the target identification, the engagement sequence. She was precise and she was complete, and she did not editorialize and she did not apologize because she had spent the 3 days since the engagement deciding that the only currency worth spending in a room like this was the truth delivered without decoration. When she finished, Reyes looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked up. "Specialist Ashford," he said, "I want to ask you something that isn't on my official list of questions." She waited. "Did you know when you made the decision to take the overwatch position that you were operating outside your authorized duties?" "Yes," she said. "And you made that decision anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because 22 people were going to die if I didn't, and I was the only person in a position to change that." She paused. "There is no version of that situation where I make a different choice. I want that on the record, not as defiance, as a statement of fact about who I am and what I believe." Reyes wrote something down. He wrote it carefully, the way you write something you want to be able to read back accurately later. "Thank you," he said. "That's all I needed." The second interview was with the colonel she hadn't recognized. His name was Wallace, and he was harder than Reyes, not unkind, but operating from a different set of priorities, which was that the existence of a communications specialist conducting unauthorized sniper operations in a combat zone created a procedural problem that had implications beyond this specific case and this specific outcome, regardless of how extraordinary that outcome had been. He made that argument for 20 minutes with the patient thoroughness of a man who believed in the argument he was making. Then he said, "Is there anything you want to say in response?" She said, "With respect, Colonel, I understand the procedural concern completely. Procedures exist for good reasons, and I'm not asking to be exempted from them. What I am asking is that the evaluation of my actions be conducted in the full context of what those actions were responding to. The intelligence, I developed the leak, I identified the ambush, I neutralized, those things didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because I was paying attention when I was supposed to be background noise." She held his gaze. "The procedures that govern what I'm authorized to do were written without accounting for situations where the person most capable of preventing a catastrophe is someone nobody expected to be capable of it. I'm not saying the procedures are wrong. I'm saying they don't have a category for me yet." Wallace was quiet for a long moment. "That," he said finally, "is either the most arrogant thing I've heard this week or the most accurate." It can be both, she said. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but something in that direction. The interview ended. It was what happened outside the interviews that mattered most. At one hung the civilian in the clean suit asked to speak with Brennan privately. Kira didn't know what was said in that conversation. What she knew was that Brennan came out of it 40 minutes later with an expression that contained something she had never seen on his face before. Not surprised, because Brennan is not a man who allowed himself to be surprised, but the particular controlled response of someone who has just been handed information that fundamentally changes the shape of the landscape. He found her at lunch. He sat down across from her with his tray and said in a voice low enough to be private without being conspicuous, "The civilian is Defense Intelligence Agency. He's been tracking the network for 14 months. The intelligence operation behind the ambush. The structured leak network, it's larger than we understood 3 days ago. Significantly larger." She put down her fork. "How large?" "We're talking about coordinated penetration of coalition intelligence infrastructure across 3 countries. 47 identified contacts. Assets embedded at multiple command levels." He kept his voice completely level, which was the only way he knew how to deliver information that warranted anything but. "The intercepts, you identified the encrypted transmissions. The frequency analysis, you didn't just find a local leak. You found the thread that pulls the entire network apart." She stared at him. "The DIA has been trying to find that thread for over a year," he said. "They knew the network existed. They knew it was sophisticated. They couldn't find the entry point." He paused. "You found it in 36 hours, alone, without knowing what you were looking for." The weight of that landed on her in stages, the way large things always arrive first, the surface of it, then the depth, then the full gravity of what it meant. She had known the leak was significant. She had understood that exposing it mattered. She had not understood, had not had any framework for understanding that the work she had done in those sleepless nights behind her screens was the piece of a 14-month federal intelligence operation that had been missing. "The investigation," she said, "is being redirected," Brennan said. "I don't have the full details yet, but the DIA doesn't expose a 47-person network and then prosecute the person who broke it open for them." She picked up her fork again, put it back down. "The soldiers who were feeding information. In custody. All 3 that we identified here. The investigation into the broader network is being handled at a level well above this command." He looked at her. "You're going to be asked to consult on the intelligence analysis. Your methodology, the way you identified the pattern in the encrypted transmissions, the DIA wants to understand it." "I was just paying attention," she said. "That's what I told them you'd say," Brennan said. "They're still going to ask." 2 days later, the statements from the 22 survivors became public within the command structure. Not public in the sense of the broader world. This was still a classified operation in a classified location, and the specific details would remain protected for years. But within the military apparatus that governed FOB Liberty and its oversight chain, the 22 statements moved through the system with a momentum that nobody who read them could slow down, because the collective force of 22 people telling the same true story about the same remarkable thing has a mass that bureaucracy cannot stop, only redirect. Whitaker's statement was the shortest, 3 paragraphs. But the last sentence of it circulated further and faster than anything else any of the 22 had written. "I am alive because someone decided that being what they were mattered more than staying invisible, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that decision." When Kira read that sentence, Brennan showed it to her, printed on paper, slid across the table without comment. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper and put it in the same pocket where she had carried Callahan's wind notes up the eastern ridge. Some things you keep. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on the 6th day. Kira was in the communications room at 0200, not working exactly, but sitting at her station in the dark, the way she sometimes did when sleep wasn't cooperating. Finding comfort in the familiar equipment, in the sounds of the frequencies, cycling through their patterns when a transmission came in on a channel that should have been silent. It was short, 11 seconds, heavily encrypted, but not encrypted the same way the previous network transmissions had been. Different architecture, different layering, the signature of a different hand. She sat up. She ran the decryption. What came out wasn't clean. It was fragments like before, but the fragments were enough. Operation continues. New coordinator assigned. Assets remain in place. Target package unchanged. She stared at the screen. Then she picked up the phone and called Brennan. He answered on the first ring. It was Euro 200, but Brennan answered on the first ring at any hour, which was something she had filed away as a data point about the kind of man he was. It's not over, she said. A pause. Just 2 seconds. Then talk to me. She talked. He listened. When she finished, the silence on the line had the quality of something being rapidly and completely reassessed. The network, he said. The DIA took out the identified assets. But whoever is running the top level of this operation has redundancy built in. They had a succession plan for exactly this scenario. She looked at the screen. They're not done, they're reorganizing, and they still have assets in place that haven't been identified yet. How long before they're operational again? Based on the transmission pattern, 2 weeks, maybe less. Another silence, different quality, the kind that precedes a decision. Send me everything, Brennan said, right now. Then call the DIA contact, I'll give you the number. Don't go through the standard chain, go directly to him. Brennan, what? This means I was wrong about something. What were you wrong about? I thought when the ambush was over and the network was exposed, the most dangerous part was finished. She kept her voice steady. I was wrong. The most dangerous part is whatever comes next. Because whoever is above the man who called himself the carpenter, whoever built that network in the first place, they know someone broke it open. And they know it happened here. The line was very quiet. Are you telling me you're worried about your personal safety? Brennan said. I'm telling you I'm worried about the safety of everyone on this base, she said. Including me, but mostly everyone else. He was quiet for 3 more seconds. Get me the transmission, he said. I'll have additional security protocols in place by Euro 400. And Kira, you did exactly the right thing calling me. Don't touch anything else on that channel until the DIA has eyes on it. Understood. She sent him the transmission. She called the DIA contact. She answered questions for 90 minutes while a man in an office somewhere she would never visit ran her data through systems she would never have clearance to see, confirming what she already knew and building the framework for what needed to happen next. At 043, she finally lay down on her cot. She stared at the ceiling. She was not afraid precisely. She was something more complex than afraid, the state of a person who has looked clearly at a dangerous situation and chosen to stay in it because leaving would mean something worse. Her father had written about that state too, page 81 of the second journal. She knew it from memory. The thing people don't understand about courage is that it's not the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters more than fear does. Once you've found what matters, that much courage stops being a choice. It just becomes what you do. She closed her eyes. She thought about her father. Not the tactical mind, not the sniper, not the legend, just Marcus Ashford, the man who had sat on a porch in Virginia, watching leaves fall, and tried in the way that people who are running out of time always try to give his daughter everything he had before he ran out of it completely. The man who had understood something about her that she hadn't understood about herself. The man who had trained her not to be a weapon, but to be something harder to make and more necessary to have. A protector. That was the word she had been circling for 6 days without landing on it. Now she landed on it and felt it settle into place with the particular rightness of something that has always been true and has finally been said. She slept for 3 hours. It was the best 3 hours of sleep she'd had in a week. 3 weeks after the engagement, on a clear morning that carried the first suggestion of autumn in the air, the formal findings of the investigation were delivered. Kira read them alone in Brennan's quarters while he stood by the window with his back to her, because he understood she needed to read without being watched. The language was dense and procedural, the way official documents always are, and she moved through it carefully, parsing the legal architecture until she reached the operative sections. Finding 1 specialist Ashford's actions on the morning of the engagement, while conducted outside the formal parameters of her assigned duties, were undertaken in direct response to an imminent and severe threat to American lives that could not have been adequately addressed through any available authorized mechanism, given the time constraints and intelligence parameters of the situation. The review board finds that these actions were consistent with the core values of military service, even where they were inconsistent with the specific letter of her assigned role. Finding 2, the intelligence analysis conducted by Specialist Ashford in the 48 hours preceding the engagement including the identification of the leak within coalition intelligence infrastructure, constitutes exceptional work that has materially contributed to an ongoing federal investigation of significant national security importance. Finding 3, no punitive action is recommended. The review board instead recommends formal recognition of Specialist Ashford's actions and a review of her current assignment classification in light of the capabilities demonstrated. She read that last line twice. Then she set the document down. Well, Brennan said, still facing the window. They're not punishing me, she said. I know. They're recommending a classification review. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. What does that mean exactly in practical terms? He turned around. It means the Army is trying to figure out what to do with you, which is a different problem from the one they started with, but it's also an opportunity if you want it. He crossed his arms. The DIA has already made a formal request for your continued involvement in the network investigation, intelligence analysis, your specific methodology. And the other thing, she said, he looked at her steadily. That's a separate conversation. That depends on what you want. She picked up the document again. Read the last line one more time. Set it down. I want to keep doing what I did, she said. Both parts, the analysis and the other part. I want to be where I can do both. That's not a standard classification, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. She met his eyes. You said there's no category for me yet. I think it's time to make one. Brennan looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man whose estimation of someone has been steadily revising upward for 3 weeks and has just reached a point where it can't go any higher without requiring a different framework. I'll make some calls, he said. She nodded. She stood up. She was almost to the door when he said her name. Kira. She turned. Your father made me promise something, he said, the last time I saw him. 2009 end of deployment. We were having a conversation about the future, his mind, what we were both going to do with whatever time we had left after everything we'd seen. He told me about you. Not the training specifically, just you, who you were, what he believed you were capable of. Brennan stopped. He was working at something, choosing words with a particular care that men who don't often speak about feeling things use when they decide to do it anyway. He said if anything ever happened to him, and if you ever ended up in a situation where you needed someone to see you clearly, to see what he saw, he hoped you'd find someone like that. She couldn't speak. I think he'd be satisfied, Brennan said quietly, with how this particular hope turned out. She nodded once. It was all she could manage. She left. She walked through the base and out through the eastern gate and stood alone with the mountains in front of her and let everything she had been holding for the last 3 weeks move through her the way rivers move through channels, not controlled, not managed, just following the shape of the ground beneath it until it found where it was supposed to go. Her father, the promise, the valley, the rifle, the 18 minutes, the 22 lives, the girl who had stood at a grave in Virginia and told her mother she was done, and the woman she had become in the years between that promise and the moment she kept what mattered more than keeping it. All of it. She held all of it, and then she let it go. Not forgot, never forgot, but released it from the place it had been locked, the place where things go when they're too heavy to carry openly and too important to put down. She released it into the understanding that it was part of her now in the permanent way that real things become permanent. Not a wound, not a burden, a foundation, something to build on. The trip to Virginia happened 6 weeks later on a gray November morning that was cold in the particular way Virginia November mornings are cold, honest, and clear, and carrying within it the smell of the last leaves coming down from the trees. She drove herself. She didn't bring anyone. She parked at the edge of the cemetery and walked through it with her hands in the pockets of her coat and her father's sniper badge. In her right hand, she had been carrying it since she left Afghanistan, keeping it in different pockets, moving it from jacket to jacket, keeping it close in the way you keep close things that represent something you haven't finished processing yet. The grave was the same as it always was. Stone name dates a simple line that the family had chosen. He protected everyone who needed protecting. She stood in front of it for a long time. She thought about what to say. She had been thinking about it for 6 weeks through debriefs and DIA consultations and the slow bureaucratic machinery of the classification review. and the nightly phone calls with her mother, who was still angry and still proud and still working out how to hold both at the same time. She had thought about eloquence, about the kind of words that carry the full weight of everything she wanted to say. In the end, she said the only thing that was actually true enough and simple enough and complete enough to say, "I finally understand, Dad." She placed the badge on the headstone. She kept her hand on it for a moment, just a moment, fingers resting on the metal, feeling the weight of it, the specific gravity of something that had belonged to Marcus Ashford and now needed to be left somewhere permanent because she didn't need to carry it anymore. She carried enough of him already, in her hands and her breath and her patience, and the part of her that knew how to find stillness in the middle of chaos and use it to protect the people who needed protecting. She stepped back. She looked at the badge on the stone, at her father's name above it, at the gray November sky above everything. Then she put her hands back in her pockets, turned around and walked toward whatever came next, the woman who had climbed a mountain in the dark and with a dead man's rifle and a broken promise, and had come down from it something the world had no name for yet, something that would take time and testimony in the voices of 22 living people to define something that had been built across a lifetime of training and 7 years of waiting and 18 minutes of absolute, ferocious, irreversible grace. They had called her the secretary. They would not make that mistake again.